Alright, hello fun and welcome back to Kottabos Space Program, where today we are having a look at the FASA Light mod, which is being made by forum user Frizzank. And what this glorious little piece of work looks to add into the game is a more lightweight version of the usual full FASA mod. And this one is being made, of course, for the version 1.8 of Kerbal Space Program, and most importantly, has no mod dependencies. The full FASA mod does require things such as roster prop monitor amongst other mods to make everything as wonderful as it can be, but this one is looking to be, well, more lightweight, as the name suggests, so that does mean some of the parts are going to be lacking. There are fewer compared to the full FASA, but there are still a lot of things in this pack. I don't remember the full exact number, but it's nearly 150 parts, which does mean, folks, gonna be straight with you here, we're not gonna be able to do our usual more in-depth look into each individual part like we normally do, because there's just too darn many of them. So let's jump into the vehicle assembly building and basically just do a quick overview of what all we do have, and then take a look at the interiors, because, well, we do have some nice interiors for things like the Gemini pod here, and then a quick launch of a really awful rocket I made with them earlier. Now let's, of course, use our Janitor's Closet mod filter to just leave on FASA and start in the command pod category with the first of the command pods, the Agena Probe Core. Now this is an unmanned command pod, pretty lightweight, not a huge amount of features, but the pretty typical things. We then have the Apollo Instrument Unit, again an unmanned command pod with a bit more stripped down features. We then have the Apollo Sub-Satellite, which is not just an unmanned command pod, but basically a completely self-contained satellite in and of itself, which is quite nice. We then have the Explorer Probe Core, which, again, another unmanned command pod with the pretty typical features you find on them. We then have the Gemini command pod holding 2 Kerbals and having the pretty typical features that you'd find on any command pod. Then we have the Gemini lander pod only holding 1 Kerbal, but still the usual things, reaction wheel, etc. We then have the Mercury command pod holding 1 singular Kerbal with the usual stuff, but also including features like an ablator. And then the Pioneer Probe Core, another unmanned command pod with the typical things, but like with the Apollo sub-satellite, it's effectively a self-contained satellite of its own, which is quite cool. Now moving into the fuel tank category, we have the Agena liquid fuel tank holding liquid fuel and oxidizer in fairly decent quantities. We then have the Apollo 3.75 meter J2 engine mounting plate. My, that's a lot to say. Also holding liquid fuel and oxidizer. After that, we have the Apollo J2 liquid fuel tank holding a fair amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Apollo Saturn 18 Stage 1 liquid fuel tank holding quite a lot of liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Apollo 5 meter F1 engine mounting plate, which holding a decent amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Apollo 5 meter J2 5X engine mounting plate with decent amounts, but kind of small liquid fuel and oxidizer compared to the other tanks. We then have the Apollo Saturn 18, a 3.75 engine mounting plate holding a small amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. Then the Apollo Saturn 5 meter large liquid fuel tank holding quite a lot of fuel. And then the Apollo Saturn 5 meter medium liquid fuel tank holding roughly about half of the previous tank. And then we have the Apollo Service Module holding a small amount of liquid fuel, oxidizer, monopropellant, and electric charge. We then have the Atlas Adapter liquid fuel tank holding a small amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer, and of course serving as an adapter between sizes. We then have another version of the Atlas Adapter liquid fuel tank, again holding a small amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer, and being a bit more elongated than the last. And then we have the Delta Cone rocket fuel tank holding liquid fuel and oxidizer, and again being kind of an even more elongated version of the previous two. Then after that, we have an external RCS tank holding a monopropellant. We then have an external rocket fuel tank holding a small, tiny amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. After that, we have the external Tri-X rocket fuel tank. I actually really love this tank. It looks awesome. Having liquid fuel, oxidizer, and monopropellant. Then after that, we have the Gemini Big G adapter tank holding a small amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. After that, we have the Gemini Centaur engine plate, which is a pretty cool one. I really like this one, holding a very tiny amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. After that, we have the Gemini Lander liquid fuel tank, holding a small amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. Then the Gemini Medium Silver liquid fuel tank, holding a decent amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have a medium version of the Gemini White liquid fuel tank, holding, again, a pretty decent amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. After that, we have the Gemini Short 2.5 meter liquid fuel tank, holding a fairly small amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Gemini Small Silver liquid fuel tank, holding a bit more, roughly double the previous tank. We then have the Gemini Small White version of the liquid fuel tank, again holding double of the small one we saw 2 ago. We then have the Gemini Titan long liquid fuel tank, holding quite a bit of fuel and is quite large. We then have the Mercury Atlas long liquid fuel tank, holding liquid fuel and oxidizer in a pretty sizable quantity. We then have the Mercury Explorer 1 Little Joe liquid fuel tank, holding a small amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Mercury Explorer 1 liquid fuel tank, holding a decent amount and being a slightly elongated tank, but very nice. We then have the Mercury 1 medium liquid fuel tank, the Mercury Explorer, pardon that, holding roughly half the previous tank. We then have the Mercury Long liquid fuel tank, holding about roughly 2.5 to 3 times the fuel of the previous one. We then have the Mercury Short liquid fuel tank, holding a small amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Mercury Short RCS tank, holding, of course, monopropellant. After that, we have the Nova 7.75 meter engine plate, holding a rather large amount of liquid fuel and oxidizer. And finally, for the tank category, the Nova 7.75 meter liquid fuel tank, holding a whole lot of liquid fuel and oxidizer. Now, next, moving into the engine category, we have the Agena Flight Pack, which is an awesome little bit of kit, which is, of course, an engine RCS, has monopropellant built in, and a few other fun little features. We then have the Agena Rocket Engine, which is not exactly powerful, but a serviceable little rocket. We then have the Apollo F1 engine, producing, oh boy, a whole lot of thrust on this thing with liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Apollo H1 engine, producing a decent amount, but not a huge amount of thrust. We then have the Apollo J2, producing a little bit more thrust than the previous one. And the Apollo Nova M1 engine, producing quite a bit of thrust. Then after that, we have the Atlas Vernier engine, providing a very, very tiny, minute amount of thrust. Then the Delta Castor solid rocket booster, producing a fairly decent amount of thrust on this one, and of course being solid fuel. We then have the Delta M83 Thor engine, which produces a fairly decent amount of thrust with liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Explorer Sergeant 11X rocket motor, which is solid fuel and is basically just a whole lot of tiny motors strapped together. And it's wonderful. We then have the Explorer Sergeant 3X, which is just 3 of those rocket motors, producing a small amount of thrust. And then the Explorer Sergeant rocket motor just being a singular version, providing a very, very tiny amount of thrust. We then have the Gemini Centaur RL10 engine, producing a reasonable but quite low amount of thrust with liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Gemini Engine and Fuel Pack Easy, which is a decoupler but also an engine with some liquid fuel and oxidizer on board. We then have the Gemini Engine and Fuel Pack for the descent stage, again with that engine thrust, decoupler, some liquid fuel and oxidizer, always nice to have. We then have the Gemini inline separation motor, which is pretty cool, goes on the outside of parts in the line, and yeah, produces thrust with solid fuel. After that, we have the Gemini lander engine using liquid fuel and oxidizer with a very small amount of thrust. Then we have the Gemini LR-91 mini rocket engine producing, for its size, quite a reasonable amount of thrust with liquid fuel and oxidizer. Next, we have the Gemini Mini SRB, which is a very, very tiny little solid rocket, which produces a small amount of thrust, but very useful. We then have the Gemini Titan 5 segment solid rocket booster, producing quite a lot of thrust, and is, just a gigantic solid fuel engine. How could you not love it? We then have the Gemini Titan 7 segment solid rocket booster, being, well, larger with more thrust and more solid fuel and just better in every way. And then the Gemini Titan LR-87 twin rocket engines, producing a pretty decent amount of thrust out of these things with liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Gemini Titan LR-91 rocket engine, producing about a third of the thrust as the previous one with liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Gemini Titan solid rocket booster, producing a fairly decently large amount of thrust, of course, with solid fuel. And then the Gemini Titan white solid rocket booster, producing a little bit more thrust than the previous one, again, solid fuel. We then have the Gemini Trans stage, which has on board, the very decent amount of thrust, as well as some built-in liquid fuel, oxidizer, and even monopropellant. We then have the Gemini Utility Pack and Decoupler, which, oh boy, has loads of stuff. Decoupler, RCS, multiple science experiments, as well as some monopropellant on board. Pretty cool little thing. We then have the Mercury Atlas booster rocket engine, producing a fairly decent amount of thrust with liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the Mercury Atlas rocket engine, producing about twice the thrust of the previous one, again with liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have the very small little Mercury liquid-fueled retro rocket engine pack, producing a small amount of thrust with liquid fuel and oxidizer, but also carrying its own supply of it. We then have the Mercury Redstone A6 rocket engine, producing a small but decent amount of thrust with liquid fuel and oxidizer. We then have another version of the Mercury Retro rocket engine pack, using solid fuel this time though, and producing a little bit more thrust than the last one of these. And then finally for the engines, we have the Pioneer Mono engine, producing a tiny little amount of thrust with monopropellant. Now, next in the command and control category, we have the Apollo APS flight pack, which is a small liquid fuel engine, but also producing some RCS power, which is always nice. We then have the Gemini ASAS mini computer, which is actually an unmanned command pod with a reaction wheel and SAS. We then have the Gemini RCS thruster pack, which is, well, an RCS thruster. We then have the Gemini RCS thruster pack, more for the top of the ship, again an RCS thruster, but also holding some monopropellant. We then have the Gemini RCS decoupler system, easy, with a decoupler and RCS built in. We then have the Gemini Retro Pack RCS, getting my words mixed up now, realistic this time, with a decoupler, a small solid fuel engine, as well as RCS built in. And then we have the Gemini winged flight pack, oh boy, words, which has a decoupler and SAS. We then finally have the Mercury RCS thruster pack, which is, well, a very small little RCS engine. Now, next in structural, we have the FASA 1.25 meter Redstone launch clamp. A very cool little launch clamp there, I like that. We then have the FASA 2.5 meter Redstone launch clamp. We then have the FASA Apollo launch clamp. And then after that, the FASA Atlas launch clamp. Then the FASA Launch Tower, I think probably my favorite of these. Then the FASA Umbilical Tower. And then the Probe Decoupler, which is just a small little radial decoupler for your small probes. Then next in the coupling category, we have the Agena docking port, which is, well, a docking node, but with a light. We then have the Apollo 3 meter J2 decoupler and engine fairing. We then have the Apollo 3 meter to 5 meter J2 decoupler and engine fairing. Then after that, the Apollo 5 meter decoupler and retro rockets, which of course actually does have some retro rockets in it, as well as the decoupler. Then we have the Apollo 5 meter J2 decoupler and engine fairing, a separator this time. And then we have the FASA Big G decoupler. It's a decoupler. And then the FASA Explorer Sergeant 11X decoupler, and it's actually a separator, not a decoupler, so kind of odd with the name there. Then we have the FASA Explorer Sergeant 3 decoupler, which again is actually a separator. We then have the FASA Mercury Engine decoupler, actually a decoupler this time. And after that, we have the Gemini Big G docking ring, which is a docking node and quite cool looking. Then we have the Gemini Titan LR91 decoupler. Then after that, we have the Mercury Atlas fairing decoupler, which is, well, decouplers. In fact, 2 decouplers. And then the Nova 5 meter to 7.75 meter decoupler and engine fairing. And it's a big decoupler with a lot of ejection force. Then next in payload, we have the Apollo 3.75 4X fairing wall. Kind of hard to see because it's always see-through no matter what you do until you go to fly, but it has a solid fuel booster in it to eject itself away from your ship. We then have the Apollo LEM 3.75 attachment plate for said fairings, and then the Gemini MOL equipment module cap to put it, kind of on the top. Then after that, the Gemini MOL-E cargo bay for all your cargo needs, and then the Gemini MOL-E equipment module, which is more 2 sort of cargo bay doors, and then the Gemini MOL-S equipment module, smaller in size at 1.25 meters. Now, in the aerodynamics category, we have the Apollo Saturn S-1B wing as a lifting surface. Then, of course, we have the Apollo Saturn V5 meter F1 engine fairing, lifting surface. We have the Explorer fairing nose cone for 1.25 meter size vessels. Then the fairing nose cone for 0.625 meter vessels. We then have another fairing nose cone for 1.25 meter vessels, and then a fairing nose cone for 2.5 meters. After that, we have a fairing wall half short 1.25 meters. It's basically just half of a 1.25 meter wall. Then after that, the Gemini winged control surface. Again, words fail me at the moment. Yes, the winged control surface there. And then the Gemini winged flight pack control surface as a nice aero surface, which is very good. Then the Gemini wing with an ablator lifting surface, RCS, the whole shebang. And then the Mercury redstone control surface, just a small little control surface. Now in ground, we only have one thing, the Gemini lander leg, which is just a basic lander leg. Now then, we have in electrical the Gemini Light, which is just a handy, nice, small little light fixture. Oh my, all these parts, my words are going all over the place. We then have a solar panel mini, which is just a small deployable solar panel. Then the station solar panel large, which is quite a large and awesome deployable solar panel. And then the station solar panel medium, which is, well, just a, as you can see, a nice elongated solar panel. Very good. Now in communication, we have the Agena antenna, which is a very nice small little data transmitter. After that, we have the Apollo sub-satellite antenna, which again, just a nice small little transmitter there. And then the Pioneer probe ANT, another cool little data transmitter. Now in science, we have the first experiment, a Geiger counter, and who wouldn't want to, detect radiation? Good times. Now next we have the Gemini Big G Science Bay, which has a whole load of experiments, plus can hold 3 crew members. We then have the Gemini MOL Manned Orbital Laboratory Science Module, which again, fun science experiments, and is a science lab holding Kerbals. And it looks beautiful. Then we have the laser mass spectrometer, my favorite of the experiments on here, which, has a cool little experiment. Then after that, we have the mini goo radiometer, which is a fun little irradiate mystery goo experiment. And then we have the probe camera, which is a probe camera. Cool. And then in the final utility category, we got some cool stuff here. The float rings for 1.25 meter size ships. Love these. Start small and then inflate. We then have the float rings for 2.5 meters, so for slightly larger vessels. We then have the float sphere, and this is a small one. And then we have the Float Sphere XL for even larger crafts if you need flotation devices. We then have the Gemini Big G crew compartment holding an additional 6 Kerbals for your missions. Quite cool there. And then we have the Gemini Big G crew compartment rescue, again holding 6 Kerbals on board and having a few resources. We then have the Gemini launch escape system with a small solid fuel booster and decoupler. And then the Mercury launch escape system, again small solid fuel booster, decoupler, always nice. Then we have the Mercury nose cone decoupler and antenna with a small antenna and of course a decoupler. Actually, a separator. Scratch that, separator. And then we have the Mercury parachute, a nice small little parachute. And finally the last part, the Mercury parachute mini, which is a very tiny little parachute, but it's wonderful. And yes, that is all of the, I think, 146 parts. My god, they're everywhere, and they're beautiful. I really love them. I especially love these flotation devices. They're really cool. But let's actually go out to the launch pad right now and take a look at the interiors of all of the different crude command pods and compartments and science modules that we do have, as they all do have custom interiors. And like I said, not using roster prop monitor, so they have just the normal sort of inbuilt gauges. And we'll start up here with the Gemini lander pod. If we go to view that, as you can see, very beautiful on the interior, lots of nice little panels, and a tiny little porthole of a window, which doesn't really quite match what it looks on the outside, but cool. We then have the, oh my god, I'm suddenly forgetting which pod this is, but, ooh, let's, the Mercury pod. There we go, with the one singular seat right there. Very cool little compartment. We then go to the Gemini pod here, where we got the 2 and a handy little sandwich sitting between our 2 Kerbonauts here. A very fun, lovely little thing. Then after that, we of course have the other side. Then we move into some of those crew compartments that you can attach on, which is pretty nice. And we have the sandwich again, but you may notice there's also some of the sandwich floating in the back, which we can see better if we go to the Kerbals that are sitting in the back seats. Yeah, we have a loose sandwich, folks. A loose sandwich. Actually, perhaps with the grill marks, a panini, but otherwise good times. But yes, 6 Kerbals in here. Love the arrangement of that. Very nice. And of course, we get the same situation in the rescue version of it. As you can see, just same thing, just, you know, with a different exterior color. And we got our fun little snack. And then finally, or actually not quite finally, we have the science lab here, which of course, as you can see, is reusing the standard in-game science lab. But if we go to the, I'm suddenly forgetting the name of it, but the other science lab, as you can see here, this one does have a custom interior. Very nice, small, and compact, with a couple of Kerbals, and I do like all the bits back there. Very cool, very fun indeed. And, yeah, back to there. What was the, oh god, yeah, what was the name of that one? The Gemini Big G Science Bay. I love that name. Oh yeah, some very cool things here. So let's actually revert this flight. Okay, I can only revert it to launch. Didn't mean to go back to the main menu. I am a fool. I am a fool. Back to here. And let's actually launch a quick rocket that I made earlier using these parts. Definitely not a proper historic rocket. I just sort of threw together a random assortment of the parts here, but you know what? It works. Barely. It barely flies. I had to take out most of the fuel to get it to fly because I was just messing around with the parts. But yes, I absolutely love the launch towers. They just look gorgeous, especially when you get them right up there, because they do have that curved plating there, so you know it looks like your Kerbals had to walk to their capsule. And it's just all in all a very fun set of parts, which yes, you could make historic Gemini and Mercury rockets with, or you could just go wild with all the parts to do some crazy fun things, which, you know, do launch sometimes. Not always, but you know, hey, that's me with rocket building. But yes, this is the FASA Light mod. A very cool, amazing set of a load of parts for you to enjoy to build just all sorts of crazy things. I love the different command pods. I love those inflatable, well, flotation devices. The solar panels are cool. Just everything about this mod pack is gorgeous. So if you'd like to have a look at it for yourself, which I would certainly recommend you go and do, you can have a look at the link in the description as per usual. But that is going to be it for today, my friends. I hope you all have enjoyed and that you do come back for the next. But until that time, thank you for watching. And as always, have a good one.